Waiting for me.
Senator Ebke, welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman Ranty and members of the Government Committee. Thank you for waiting for me. I was in Judiciary. For the record, I'm Senator Laura Ebke, that's L-A-U-R-A-E-B-K-E, and I represent the 32nd Legislative District, made up of Saline, Jefferson, Thayer, and Fillmore counties, as well as the southwest corner of Lancaster County. I'm here today to introduce Legislative Resolution 35. Now, you've all heard a little bit about LR 35 over the last couple of days. LR 35 is a little different than most of what we hear in our legislative hearings. It doesn't seek to change or add to statute. What it does do, however, is ask for the Nebraska legislature to exercise a power that it has under the U.S. Constitution and to request a convention of the states for the purpose of addressing some of the structural problems that we have in our country which threaten our children and grandchildren's futures. As I was out campaigning the last 2 years, I found a remarkable number of people who would talk to me on their doorsteps or in town halls, but much of the time they didn't really want to talk about state issues. What they were worried about, rather, was sort of the amorphous Washington. Did you hand out? Okay, thank you. What they wanted to talk about was Washington. They were worried about the national debt, which has topped $18 trillion. They were worried about the ever-increasing tax burdens. They were worried about the runaway regulation, mostly, but not exclusively at the national level. And yes, they were even worried about Obamacare. My takeaway was that while they were a little bit puzzled by the state process, they still felt somewhat connected to those of us in Lincoln, but they felt disconnected from the national government. Some of the questions I got were even along the lines of, can you just make Washington leave us alone? While I was running, I tried to set those questions aside, remind people that I was running for a state office, and show my empathy with their frustration. But I really wasn't thinking about what I could do about this problem. I should say, parenthetically, that while I had heard about the Convention of States movement, I had never really given it much thought. In point of fact, I was a political science instructor teaching American government, and my greatest concern with the concept of the Convention of States was that it would end up with some sort of a crazy runaway convention and end up with something far worse than the status quo. So, fast forward a little bit to this past Christmas after the election was over, and I was at Christmas with my extended family, and my brother looks at me as I walk in the door and he says, "So, are you going to introduce a resolution for Convention of the States?" I hemmed, hawed, and ducked the question. But my brother is a pretty smart guy, so I started doing a little more reading over the next couple of weeks, and then all of the pieces sort of fell into place for me. You see, I had failed to think of the Convention of the States as what it is. Via Article 5, it is just another way of proposing amendments to the Constitution. Now, you have in front of you, I think we handed out a copy of Article 5 of the Constitution. I just want to read that into the record. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution. That's the way that we always think about the Constitution of the United States being amended. But then there's that little word, or, okay, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution. It's obvious that the founders intended for this to be a viable option. It's also important for you to remember this. Even though it's never been done before, as far as an actual convention being called, there have been efforts made across the years, since the very beginning. In 1893, in fact, Nebraska, yes, our very own state of Nebraska, filed for a convention of the states to call for the direct election of senators. In the next 10 years, another 12 or 13 states filed for that as well. Before the time of the deadline on that original filing expired, we didn't have a convention. but a number approaching 20 states saw this as a legitimate means for making change. Okay? They made an application of some sort, and ultimately we know that Congress saw this effort of the states trying to promote proposal or convention via this application process, and Congress took matters into their own hands and proposed the 17th Amendment and sent it out to the states. But the fact that Congress took that action, I don't think diminishes the legitimacy of these efforts. It doesn't suggest that a convention of the states is somehow out of the mainstream, just because it hasn't been done before. And in fact, in the late 30s and early 40s, there were around 12 or 14, depending on how you count different petitions with similar subject matter. There were between 12 and 14 applications dealing with income tax limits that went to Congress. Several states in the mid-40s applied for a convention to place term limits on the president before the Congress got around to sending the 22nd Amendment to the states. There are literally hundreds of examples of applications for a convention of the states to propose amendments on dozens of different topics. Perhaps today, because of our communications capabilities, the chance of success is greater. You know, imagine the previous communication barriers to get to that point. You know, to have identical calls proposed in in 2/3 of the states. Others will be following me behind me who will probably make reference to this. But let me just say a few words about the legislature's appropriate authority as state legislators under the federal Constitution. Yesterday I noted in comments on the floor that there are limited powers remaining for the state legislatures in the federal Constitution. Each one of us has, however, sworn to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States as well as of our state. So I think it behooves us to take seriously those powers that we do have and to carefully deliberate over the possibilities that those powers hold for us and for improving our country. This power, the power to be part of a call for a convention of the states to propose amendments, again, propose amendments, can only be done in concert with a number totaling 2/3 of the states, or at least 34 total. In many ways, the fact that it requires 3/4 of this, or 2/3 of the states, in and of itself dispels the fear of a convention out of control. I mean, what are the chances that all 34 states are just going to go crazy? And even once the call is complete, okay, assuming we get all 34 states to agree to a call, I'm inclined to believe that getting everyone to agree on the rules, to show up in the same place at the same time, and to agree on every word of every amendment that might be proposed will be difficult. Doesn't mean that it's impossible, but it's not going to be easy. I've read Madison's notes on the convention in 1787, and it's pretty clear that coming to an agreement in 1787 wasn't all that easy either. This won't be an easy task, but I would argue to you that it shouldn't be an easy task. That changing our foundational document shouldn't be easy, but I do think that it might be necessary. I've come to believe that even though it's difficult, if we care about not just our future, but the future of our children and their children, then we have to undertake the effort to get control of the federal government. As I put on my political science teacher hat, let me remind you, we aren't and were never intended to be a purely democratic, unitary system, with all of the power residing at the national level and grants of power being given to units of government below. We were intended, however, to be a federal republic, with the ultimate sovereignty resting in the hands of the people, but with governing power being divided and diffuse, so that no one group of people, no one branch of government, or one location of government would become too powerful. Today, we have in many ways allowed the states to become pawns of the national government. And frankly, I don't think we can expect members of Congress to voluntarily fix the problem or to offer amendments to the states for ratification. I would argue that it's up to us and the legislatures of at least 33 other states to get together, propose amendments, and to force the issue. The Convention of the States resolution before you for consideration asks for Nebraska to apply for the calling of a convention of the states limited to proposing amendments that deal with imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government, limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limiting terms of office for members of Congress. Nothing more happens until 33 other states think that this is a good idea. There are other Article 5 groups out there, some with very different goals, and the fact that they are advocating for the different goals via Article 5 validates the legitimacy of the idea and the surety of a limited scope convention. If those promoting various Article 5s thought that the scope was wide open, they'd all be gathering around one effort, I suspect, and then let ideas fly wild at a convention. Again, there will be a number of proponents and perhaps others who will speak after me. I think some of you have had a chance to meet with Mark Meckler with Citizens for Self-Government. He and his group have been working on the Convention of the States for some time, so he will probably be able to tell you much more about thinking with respect to rules, timing, selection of representatives, etc., as well as about what's happening around the country and other states, if you're so interested. But I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you might have of me at this point.
Thank you, Senator Epty. I have a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
So you had addressed in part the concept of a runaway convention. So what happens if this constitutional convention gets called and the delegates from the states send something out that is outside the scope of the call? Is the only limitation just the state's ability to not ratify it, or?
Well, sure. Remember that anything that goes out as an amendment, as a proposed amendment, still has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states.
Right.
So it's what, 13 states vote against it, and it's not going to. I think that's about right. Is that the right number? 13 states vote against it, and it doesn't happen.
Right.
Beyond that, I think that a case can be made that the legislators have the authority to direct their delegates to vote in a particular way, or to move in a particular direction on any amendments, in the case of the unlikely case of a runaway convention.
But let me give you maybe a state issue parallel, okay? If the governor calls a special session and the governor's call is specific to a subject matter and the legislature passes a law that is outside the scope of that subject matter, the litigation would be immediate, and a court would immediately throw it out. Okay, so there is. It's not just a fallback plan that whatever comes out of that special session could be. There's a referendum process, or there's a way to undo it. It is if the legislature acts outside the scope of the call, whatever they do outside of that scope is going to be struck down by a court. Mm-hmm. If a constitutional convention operates in a way that is outside the scope, is there some sort of similar mechanism to strike it down before, outside of just the state legislatures mm-hmm. having the ability to undo it?
It's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. And Mr. Meckler is an attorney, and he may have a better sense of that. My off the cuff response would be that I think it's incredibly unlikely that it would happen, just because of the pure numbers, mm-hmm. because of the call that has been issued, and the nature of the nature of the application for the call. But yeah,
my concern,
mm-hmm.
and I'd like you to address it, is if I were a group who thought more along the lines of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who has made it pretty clear that in her view the Constitution is malleable, imperfect to the very least, okay, at the very least. And if I were part of a section of the country who believed that, what I would do in that instance is take our Constitution, which is negative rights, so it is a Constitution which restrains government, and propose a series of extremely popular, good-sounding constitutional amendments which would be very difficult to oppose and very easy to demagogue, and such as granting rights on certain things. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's that far-fetched to get legislatures from around the country to sign off on that, and then the laws that would follow has the potential to be the problem, not the amendments themselves, but then we'd be stuck with it.
Sure.
That's my concern.
Well, I think, and honestly, that is part and parcel of the concern that I had about it for years. You know, I said I taught political science for 25 years, and you know, the way I always taught the Constitution was, you know, okay, we had all these people showing up in Philadelphia, and they were just supposed to amend the Articles of Confederation, and instead, what did we get? We got this whole new Constitution, as good as it might be. This is what we got. I think it's a very different situation. I think we also left out some of the specific call that the founders had. Plus, remember, things still have to be ratified, and it's a big number that has to be ratified. I don't see it as nearly the problem. I understand, but the problem is things are out of control, I would argue, and what's the option? You know.
I suspect if you and I sat in a room together, we would be able to come up with ways where in the last 10 years, Congress and the federal government has acted in ways that violated constitutional principles.
Absolutely.
If Congress is ignoring the Constitution as it's written now, why would they pay any attention to these constitutional amendments that a constitutional convention would come up with?
Part of that problem, I think, is that is the courts. The courts have allowed that interpretation, and the idea behind a constitutional amendments would be that we would clarify. We would clarify expectations. You know, over the last 200 years, especially the last 100 years, the courts have taken very broad interpretations of the Commerce Clause and, you know, all sorts of other things. And so, you know, if we clarify that via constitutional amendment, I think that makes it a whole lot tougher, both politically and in reality, for courts and for the Congress and the President and everybody else to overtly violate the Constitution. And if they do that, then you know, maybe there's some price to pay politically.
We'll see.
Right.
Senator Larson.
Thank you, Senator Edke. First of all, in principle, I support the concept of a convention of the states. I like the concept. It's something that interests me, especially since America is the first true representative democracy / representative government.
Let's call it a republic.
Yeah,
okay?
representative republic. I guess the Greeks were the first democracy, but representative republic. There are issues within our system that are that other nations across the world have improved upon. Our basic ideas. Now this is a resolution. Does everyone have to be exactly the same for the convention to happen? So I see yours talks about the scope of the convention is X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. Does every single one adopted have to be exactly the same?
That's the approach that the Convention of the States has applied, just because they believe that if you do that, it ensures that Congress can't ignore it when they make the call based on the applications.
And reading through these, so like I said, first of all, I don't have a problem with the concept of a convention of the states, and I can understand Senator Moranti's concerns. That brings me to the second part of your LLR, knowing that I support the concept. Now we have to debate what's in here and whether or not we want to do this,
right.
And less so. And what are fiscal restraints? I mean, we talk about imposed fiscal restraints. Now, is that limiting national debt? Is that, I think that becomes very broad and then we can talk about, do we want to limit? I think we are too far in debt, but at the same time, the U.S.'s ability to devalue the ruble is a national security thing, and to do that, we might have to do QE, which you get what I'm saying. That there's a number of issues moving in through here,
and that's why we have a convention. We get people with serious ideas, and to sit down and talk about it.
Limit. And I appreciate that. I just knowing that I do support the concept, now I have to. The worry is to call one would be great, but then I know if we did call one, then 3/4 of the legislatures would have to pass what would be done.
And it wouldn't necessarily have to be 3/4 of the legislatures. I mean, you could do it through a convention within the state, so each state could call a convention as well. So you could have a convention of the people within the states. That's the alternative way of ratifying. It's been done, I think, once, maybe just once when we ended prohibition.
So the all right. So
You could have
opens
convention.
up a lot more questions.
Like I said, it's only been done once.
So the convention of the people, is that just whoever shows up and the majority wins?
Right.
Or?
I mean, the legislature would have to determine how that was going to, how the ratification process is, and that would be part of the convention too, to determine how the ratifications would take place.
So you're saying we could host the legislature would get to decide if the convention of the people happens at the Holiday Inn Express in O'Neill?
I think that the convention of the states, if I understand the process correctly, and again, this is something that's new.
coming back to ratify what the states do.
And in 1929, was that the year that that prohibition ended? 31? 33? When prohibition ended, my understanding is that Congress, knowing that the state legislatures would not ratify the abolition of prohibition, designated that the ratification process would be by popular conventions within the states. So that would be part of the and if Mark corrects me on all this, I'll be in trouble.
Well, yeah, and that kind of like who gets seated at the convention.
But the convention, as part of the amendment process, the amendment proposal process, would then define how the amendments would be ratified when they go back out to the state. So they could either do it through the state legislatures, or they could do it through conventions in the states, but it would have to be in 3/4 of the states.
Yeah, like I said, and I appreciate the explanation, and I think you're right in the sense that it would be difficult to get 3/4 on a lot of things. There's obvious ways around it, and I support the concept, and I support different scopes as well, but I worry about when you talk about imposing fiscal restraints on federal government, and I know that it's my generation that's going to have to pay off the debt, and not the generation of
Not my generation, is that what you're saying?
well, you're going to be yours to a certain extent,
Yeah.
but more so mine and your children's and
That's right.
grandchildren's, and not so much Senator Groney's generation. But and so I get the concept, but the concerns, fiscal restraints can go both ways too. What's a fiscal restraint? Is that Keynesian? Is that depending on who shows up at the convention?
Well, and that's where each of the legislatures decide how they're going to allocate their membership. So you'll have a diverse group, but there was a diverse group sitting in Philadelphia in 1787 too, and they figured it all out.
I appreciate it. And I support the concept again. I wish it didn't. I understand why it has to be limited, and at the same time, we have to wrestle with that. So
Right.
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Senator Larson. Senator Groney.
Thank you, Chairman Morante. Senator Epke, who represents the state of Nebraska at the convention?
That would be up to the legislature to decide.
Would it be a secret vote?
If we want it to be, I guess. No, I don't know. I mean, I think
But it wouldn't be the congressmen and the
No.
senators in
It
Washington
would be
that we're
who-
trying to
the-
term limit here.
No, They would be, the legislature would determine how they were going to select their representatives. And, you know.
Would it be delegates with the senators?
Delegates, yeah.
From the,
It could be members of the legislature, it could be citizens, it could be, I mean, I think that the options are wide open. And my understanding is that each state gets one vote.
Is how we do that in Senator Chambers' rule book?
We'll figure that out when we get to 34.
Ever evolving. Senator Bloomfield.
Thank you, Chair. Senator Senator Epke.
Yes.
Is there a time limit?
No, actually, there's, I mean, as far as how long it,
Well, if we pass the resolution this year, if we were to put the resolution out on the floor, it could still be sitting there 15 years from now,
Yep.
waiting for the other 20 states to come along?
yep, if you look at the, I believe it's in the last, the application constitutes a continuing application in accordance with Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States until the legislatures of at least 2/3 of the several states have made application on the same subject. So, yes.
That's
if no-
troubling to me, that it would continue just to hang out there.
Well, I don't know, the 27th Amendment was just ratified not all that long ago, and it was one of the originals passed as part of that would have been part of the Bill of Rights. It was one of the originals back in 1791, and it's just been in the last 15, 20 years that it was ratified.
I can see if we hang out there 15, 20 years, we'd be looking at a whole different group of issues by the time they got around to it, that we may or may not agree
But
on.
these are still the issues. I mean, it may disappear if our economic problems go away, and if,
But this never disappears, and that.
But it would require, but it still requires 34. It still requires those 34 to sign on, so if nobody else signs on, it just disappears.
Is there a method of retract? When does it disappear, though? Does it disappear 100 years from now if we don't get?
Well, if nobody signs on to it, it's just there. There are a whole bunch of them out there that honestly, that have been filed with Congress that are still hanging out there. They've become largely irrelevant. You know, there was one on slavery back in 1861. There was one on, there have been some on the presidential, the presidential term limits, which became, unnecessary. There have been a number of them. I think there was one on Article 12, Amendment, the 12th Amendment, or that. Yeah, there have been a number of them.
It may be a question for somebody behind you, but is there a way to put a sunset clause on it to where we can say if this hadn't happened in 5 years, we're no longer going to be bound by this?
Well, I don't think that we would put a sunset clause on this, but I don't think that there would necessarily be any problem, with the legislature retracting it.
Okay,
I
thank
mean,
you.
I think that would be possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bloomfield. Are there any additional questions? Senator Grunny?
All right, so you get 34 now. We got 34 independent states. Who steps forward and said where we're going to have it? Who's going to call it? The date? Who's going to set up the dates? So when does this happen?
We all get on Google Docs and decide. We're a long ways from that. You know, I think 3 states have approved it.
3 have?
I believe. Is that correct? Yeah.
When did the push start for this?
A couple years ago?
No,
Last year?
legislative cycle.
Okay, so.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Grunny. Any final questions for Senator Epke? Seeing none, thank you for your
Thank you.
And we will proceed to proponent testimony on LR 35. Proponents.
Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee, my name is Mark Meckler. For the record, that's M-E-C-K-L-E-R. And I'm president of Convention of States Action, the group that is here promoting the Convention of States resolution here in the legislature. I'd like to start with a little bit of history if we could, because I think it's important to set the stage for why we're here, and specifically why we're here with you. In 1787, in that fateful convention, 2 days before the end of the convention, Colonel George Mason from New York stood and pointed out what he considered to be a fatal flaw in the document that those men had drafted. And the flaw was this: that Article 5 contained a provision allowing the federal government to propose amendments to the Constitution should they deem them necessary. But Article 5 didn't contain a way for the people, acting through their states, to propose amendments similarly. And he said something like this. He said, "Are we so naive that we believe that a federal government that becomes a tyranny will propose amendments likely to restrain its own tyranny?" And we ask that question today. The answer is obviously no. No government will do that. No government ever has. And the wisdom was so obvious there in 1787, 2 days before the end of the convention, that Madison's notes actually reflect there was no debate on the matter. That the amendment, the request to put in the second clause of Article 5 giving you, the state legislatures, the power to call an amending convention, specifically to propose restraints on the tyranny of federal government, was adopted unanimously. One of the few things actually adopted unanimously in that cantankerous convention in 1787. So the founders, the framers, saw that they needed to invest in you the ultimate power over the federal government. This is really extraordinary. I travel all over the country. I speak with state legislators all over the country. I can honestly say I had no idea 5 years ago that power was in there. I would say that probably at least half of the state legislators I talk to have no idea that they actually have power over the federal government. When I talk to state legislators all over the country, they often tell me, we're just under the pressure of the federal government constantly. They impede our authority. The EPA invades our state. We're dealing with the strictures of Obamacare and other programs that are imposed on us, unfunded mandates that we have to deal with in our state. We're struggling with all these things that the federal government is imposing on us. And so often they say there's nothing we can do about it. We deal in our ever-shrinking area of authority, and that's all that we can do. The reality is the founders gave you a gift. They sent a message to you in a bottle across the ages, and that message said that they were counting on you, state legislators, to be the last line of defense for liberty. They were counting on you if the federal government ever became too big and too powerful, ever exceeded the bounds set by the Constitution, that you, state legislators, would get together from all across the country and step up and restrain them. And so we're here today to ask you to do that, to step up and provide that restraint. 3 states have now passed this application: Florida, Georgia, and Alaska, not small states. Application is now pending in roughly 30 states around the country. More are adding every day. We expect that by the end of next legislative session, 2016, that we can hit the 34 number. That's our realistic goal. And hopefully call the convention in 2016. So with that, I'd like to open it to questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions? Senator Bloomfield.
Yeah. Excuse me. Mr. Meckler, I'd like to ask you the same question I asked Senator Ebke. Is there any way to put a time limit on this to where it's not hanging out there 15 years from now?
In fact, many states have actually acted in that way. We have a history on the Balanced Budget Amendment, commonly referred to as the BBA. And we got to the point where 32 states in the early 80s had passed the BBA, and a bunch of states decided they didn't like that idea and decided to rescind, and they actually voted to rescind their application. So the process is a simple vote for rescission.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bloomfield. Any additional questions? Senator Groney?
Thank you, Chairman. What's the timeline? I mean, so they all gather in Philadelphia again, hopefully North Platte. Anyway, and who organizes it? Who decides sets the agenda? Who says that this is going to be done in 6 months or 2 months? Or how is that all decided?
Well, let's walk our way through the full process. So 34 states file their applications. Senator Ebke was correct. Those applications need to be the same, so we get what's called aggregation, so that we don't have to fight with Congress about whether 34 states have actually called. Once you do that, Congress has one duty, actually 2 duties in this process. One is to set the time and place for the convention. Now, I expect, with what I know about Washington, D.C., and what you guys probably know, that they're going to say Washington, D.C. is the place for the convention. I don't know exactly what they'll set as far as the time. Our position is, and we have legal authority for this, our position is if Congress doesn't set that convention pretty rapidly, we will encourage the states to send a letter to Congress simply saying they are setting their own time. The states in this instance are acting as sovereign entities, not under the power of the federal government. They're acting in a power above the federal government. And so they can call the time if the federal government fails to do so. I assume it'll be D.C. And then most of the leaders that I've talked to in the states around the country that are seriously considering this say they would go to D.C. for 1 hour, convene, and then they would recess and go somewhere in the center of the country, maybe here. And so I've heard lots of suggestions for where, but I expect, then the convention, by the way, sets their own rules. There's now an organization of state legislators from all around the country that have gotten together called the Assembly of State Legislators, and they are drafting a rule set right now. The goal is to come into convention with the majority of states already having agreed on a rule set. They're basing those rules on Mason's rules, which about 75% of state legislators use and are familiar and comfortable with around the country. And then they'll add on whatever special rules they need for an amending convention. So that's the general process as it lays out. It's important to note that the law of convention, when you guys pass a statute, you're passing a law. The law of the convention is the application. Those three subject matter areas, that limits what can be discussed in convention. And then obviously sometimes when you pass laws, then there are regulations that are drafted that allow those laws to be put into effect. Those are essentially the rules of convention that will be drafted in convention itself, or hopefully by Assembly of State Legislatures and then voted on by 26 states in convention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Browning. Senator Bloomfield.
Thank you. If we were to proceed down this path and elect a delegate to go to that convention, do they receive pay of some sort? And if so, who covers that? Does the state do that? How much is it?
That would actually be up to you as a state. I mean, if we go back to historically in the 1787 convention, they received no remuneration for their services, and they all paid their own way. The state could decide however they want to do it. Delegate selection, how the delegates are treated, what the authority of delegates is up to every state. And as an important part of that process, by the way, you're going to limit delegate authority. Each delegate, or they're actually called commissioners when they go to a convention, each commissioner is sent with what's called a commission. That commission is essentially the contract that limits or says what their authority is. According to standard law of agency, I can tell you, you have the right to limit any agent's authority to act on your behalf. If they act outside the scope of that authority, you have the right to say that they're not acting within their authority, and their authority has no actual legal effect under any law. And some states are actually passing something called the Delegate Limitation Act. It was first proposed in Indiana by Senate President Pro Tem David Long. That act actually imposes a 5-year felony penalty for any delegate that exceeds their authority when they go to a convention. So you guys have very strong control over your delegates before, during, and during deliberations in the convention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bloomfield. Senator Larson.
Do only the 34 states that petition Congress get to send people, or do all 50 get to go?
Now, this is what's called an application for a general convention, so all 50 states would be
So all
invited to
50
attend.
states
That's correct.
And anything that comes out of the convention to go to the rest of the states, is that just 50 plus 1% to adopt a proposed amendment to go to the states, or within the convention? I mean, the vote within the convention.
Generally, within the convention, the vote is simple majority, so it'd be 26 states to pass something out of convention out for ratification to the states.
And each state gets one vote.
That's correct.
And you talked about the state can place restraints on their delegates, or group of delegates. So the legislature is really the only one, since my understanding, we're the ones that get to decide who the delegates are.
That's correct.
The legislature could say, we could have the debate. I don't know if we pass another resolution when we decide who goes, that we as a legislature support term limits, and you can't go outside those bounds.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Or we support a balanced budget amendment, or we don't support a balanced budget amendment.
Absolutely. You're able to restrict your delegates' behavior in any way you desire.
All right, so that leads to my next question. Again, I support a convention, or the ability to have the convention, but now I'm getting into the weeds, and maybe I shouldn't. What happens when we call a convention and 25 states, or we know essentially there's just not enough votes to pass anything, because states have already the legislatures have already delegated the power.
Or limited the power.
Or limited,
Right.
or limited the power,
Right.
or delegated, you
Right.
will do X.
Practically speaking, I don't think that anybody would send anybody to convention. I mean, you guys will be looking at the delegates who are coming. What are the commissions? Those are generally all public documents, like anything you guys do in the legislature. And I presume that if everybody had limited their delegates in such a way that nobody was coming, or that nobody could do anything, that nobody would attend the convention from a practical perspective.
From a practical point.
You guys, I have a lot of faith in state legislators. Maybe it's misplaced. You guys can tell me
You
here.
haven't been observing us very long, have you?
And in all seriousness, I travel around the country. I meet with a lot of state legislators. I spend time in D.C. as well. I'll be there tomorrow, unfortunately. And I don't have a lot of faith in those guys. There's not a lot of common sense in D.C., but when you travel around the country, it's amazing the common sense. And especially in a legislature like this, you guys are inside. Maybe you don't see it. I see it as an outsider. You guys are citizen legislators. That's what the founders intended. They expected you guys to be running things. They trusted the common sense of the average person. And I think they were right then, and I believe in my experience traveling around the country, they're right today.
And for the record, I guess am I still questioning?
Yeah, you're still recognized.
Because we talked a little bit before, imposing fiscal restraints might constitute just the ability or a constitutional amendment that says the Federal Reserve must be audited every 5 years. It might not be a balanced budget amendment.
Correct.
What happens do you fear that legislatures do get too limiting, like the only part of the imposed fiscal restraints you can vote for is a balanced budget amendment, but all of a sudden they start discussing an audit of the Fed, and now our delegate has that restriction of, well, I only have the authority from my state to vote for a balanced budget amendment. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
So
I'm not worried about that because, we have text messages and email, and if your delegate believes that something's coming up at convention that they don't have the authority to discuss and they think they should be discussing it, they're going to confer with your legislature or a special committee you've created in your legislature and say, should I be discussing this? Do you want me to be discussing this? I don't have the authority to discuss this. And then you could edit the commission at any time. You have the authority. I want you to think about this as any contract you have, a service contract with somebody who acts as your agent.
Well, legislatures move slowly. Take Nebraska, for example. We could be in July or August,
right.
And if the legislature, the whole body, and I'm just saying, that's a concept.
Right.
We don't.
Well, and you're not alone in that. We've got legislatures that meet less often than you. You've got Texas meets every 2 years, and what if they're not in session? And the answer that I give, because I've been asked this question all over the country, is this is an extraordinary circumstance, right? You're talking an Article 5 amending convention for the first time in the history of the United States of America. The entire country will be watching. I can assure you, whether you're in session or not, you guys will be paying attention. I would presume, and some of the part-time legislatures I've talked to have said that they would put together a standing committee to be paying attention and to be authorized to take action at all times, regardless of what's going on. We haven't done this before. It's extraordinary, and it is going to take extraordinary measures to be prepared to deal with it. And so that's what I've heard from states that have discussed that issue that have part-time legislatures.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you, Senator Larson. Senator Groene.
Thank you, Chairman. Does this convention have the authority to repeal existing amendments, like parts of some, like the Second Amendment?
A repeal of I've been asked this question many times, a repeal of part of the Second Amendment would expand the scope and authority of the federal government. In other words, it would allow the federal government to more fully regulate firearms. I think that's a pretty clear amendment, by the way. I don't agree with the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Second Amendment. It says shall not infringe.
Can this convention?
No, so the convention would have no authority because that would expand the authority of the federal government. So anything that would give the federal government more power over the citizen.
So when they repealed the prohibition, they repealed one there.
But that was, first of all, that was not a convention.
All right.
That was done by congressional application to the states, and the states then by 3/4 approved that. And again, even in that case, what that did is actually limited the authority of the federal government. So today, if we had prohibition and you went into convention, you probably could call for the repeal of prohibition to allow free trade and consumption of alcohol, which would reduce the scope of the authority of the federal
So you're
government.
telling me Article 5 says you can only limit, you can't add?
Article 5 doesn't say that. The application, which we have drafted, specifically limits the convention to limiting the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government, imposing fiscal restraints, or imposing term limits on federal officials.
What worries a lot of folks, they get down and a few states, half the states really want fiscal responsibility, wants a balanced budget. And then some wants open borders.
Right.
So because they're hungry and they want something done, they compromise, and then we end up with something that's worse than what we had. What about this word compromise? Is it pretty much dictated that the states tell them what to do and that's it? And they get down there and there's no compromise that I'll give you this, you give me that?
That's absolutely it. It's the same as, let me give you a real world legal example. It's the same as you hire an insurance agent. You contract with that person, they are now your agent. You give them authority to bind you to a policy of insurance, and you tell them, I'm willing to pay $1,500 a year for that insurance, and I want these provisions in it. Now, if they come back to you and they say, Senator, I've bound you to a policy of insurance, it's now $10,000 a year, you're not bound to that policy of insurance. They had no legal authority to act on your behalf, to bind you to that policy of insurance. You gave them authority up to a certain level. And this is the same way, this is a law of agency.
So when we come back, we can not vote for it.
Not only not vote for it, but you'll be paying attention to what they're doing while they're there. And should they be discussing those sorts of things, the responsible legislators that you are, you'll be paying attention to that, and you'll be on the text message saying, we're watching you, what are you doing? You can't be talking about those things.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Green. Senator Hansen.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just in kind of the larger concern of the limiting the scope of a constitutional convention. What are you basing that interpretation on? I see you referencing agency law, but what else are you basing that interpretation
Sure.
on?
And the agency law is less about limiting the scope of the convention than it is limiting the actual authority of a commissioner to the convention. So the actual convention, there are multiple layers of scope limitation that are in place. The first layer is the application itself, which hopefully you guys have seen. That's the resolution that you guys have, and that sets the law of the convention. And it says convention is only for the purposes of discussing fiscal restraints on the federal government, restraints the scope and power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and the imposition of term limits on federally elected officials. And so that gives you the parameters of the convention right there. Those are the legal parameters which may be discussed. And then from a, feel free to jump in.
But I'm going to say,
Yeah.
but why? The Constitutional Convention for proposing amendments to the states, just by the plain reading of Article 5, there's nothing that necessarily grants the power to limit the scope of the convention.
Well, the problem, so you're mixing language, which is important. I apologize for parsing here. I'm a lawyer, and the Constitution is about language, and it really matters. So one is we're not dealing with a constitutional convention. So that's really important. We're dealing with a convention of the states for proposing amendments under Article 5 of the Constitution. Technically speaking, when we talk about a constitutional convention, there is such a thing. It's called a plenipotentiary convention. And when you sit down to draft a convention from scratch, that's referred to as a constitutional convention. And that has no barriers. You can't impose barriers on that. In fact, Montana did that in 1972, so it's been done relatively recently in states here. But this is an Article 5 amending convention, and it is bounded by the state's application because the states are sovereign authorities. And they are gathering under their sovereign authority as sovereign states, and they can limit it to whatever they want because they are sovereign states.
Is it safe to say that there are plenty of people, or at least some people, who disagree with that interpretation?
Absolutely. There are people who disagree with that interpretation.
See, just from my background, I have experience of talking with a law professor in my instance who was an advocate of convention of the states, but he was explicitly an advocate in the sense of there was no bounds and they could address many different problems far greater than the state legislatures would be willing to.
Right.
So that was the basis of my question.
The history of convention in the United States of America is long and varied. There were 11 conventions in the colonies, in the states prior to the 1787 convention, and then 2 years prior. There have been over 40 interstate conventions since, not general conventions in the sense that they were getting together to amend the Constitution, but conventions for interstate compacts, for example. The Colorado River is governed by a compact negotiated between the states. Every delegate was sent by their sovereign state, according to instructions. The convention was held according to an application. Each delegate was given their instructions. That's our history. The Supreme Court has ruled multiple times, over 40 cases, interpreting Article 5 and discussions of Article 5. And in all times, the Supreme Court has held that history rules Article 5. This is how Article 5 has always been run in our country. So what the Supreme Court has always said, this is what we've always done when we've gotten into convention. And if you look at the list of folks who say that this could be a quote-unquote runaway convention, that list starts at the top, and most of them are issuing talking points from an organization called the John Birch Society. Birch Society chased out of legitimate public discourse and politics 30 to 40 years ago. And you will see those talking points reiterated by an organization that still spews anti-Semitic hatred and the like. So if you look at the weight of legal authority in America, if you look at, for example, the foremost conservative constitutional scholar in America is at Princeton. His name is Robbie George. He's a supporter of this. Signed something called the Jefferson Statement. Says absolutely absurd that there could be a runaway convention. Got Randy Barnett, runs the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. Says absolutely absurd. David Rivkin, one of the leading constitutional lawyers, litigators in America. Charles Cooper, who is the lead constitutional litigator for the National Rifle Association. Obviously, not somebody that would be amenable to a runaway convention where the Second Amendment could be affected. All of these legal authorities, the great weight of legal authority in America, prominent legal scholar says there cannot be a runaway convention.
Okay, thank you.
Let me follow up on that a little
Yes,
bit.
please.
So, let's say we pass this, 34 states do it, and we have the Constitutional Convention. So it's kind of, I'm going to ask you a comparable question to what I asked.
Yeah,
Not a
please.
Constitutional, an Article 5 convention, not a Constitutional
Thank
Convention.
you.
I don't want to
I
make that
appreciate
mistake
that.
again. Okay.
Thank you.
So it's an Article 5 convention, and, you know, on one extreme or the other, you know, it doesn't matter.
Right.
There are sufficient votes to attach a constitutional amendment to say that life begins at conception, or
Right.
there's sufficient votes to say that healthcare is a fundamental human right.
Right,
There are sufficient votes at the convention to submit that to the states.
right.
What happens then?
So I would argue that there is full legal authority for challenging those proposed amendments as outside the scope of the Constitution. To be perfectly clear, it's never happened, so I can't say here's a precedent, here's a case where it's been done. But sovereign states have the authority to litigate on their own behalf when their delegates or people to whom they send to a convention exceed their authority. Literally by standard agency law, by the law of sovereign states, you would actually, interestingly, this is more like a bunch of countries getting together because they're sovereign states. So they would have the right to litigate that in federal court, absolutely. And I believe there would be immediate, massive, multi-state litigation to stop that. And I believe that that litigation would probably even come sooner than that.
Okay.
I believe if it appeared that the convention was spiraling out of control, a lot of conservative legal scholars, if it was spiraling out of control in a left-leaning way, or liberal scholars in a right-leaning way, would jump into that and would relish that fight. I think it's also important to know this is a political proposition, right? To get to 34 states takes incredible political will of the people. You guys aren't doing this on your own. You have constituents who are interested, organizations who are interested. That pressure will be brought to bear all through the convention process, good and bad. I think your example was a great one, by the way. I mean, I think the most difficult thing to deal with in a convention or in politics in general is when people propose things that sound great and are pretty scary in the long run. But we do have the law of the convention, which is the scope limited by the application itself.
Okay, Senator Larson?
Is there any set length of time once the convention happens that the states have to ratify the amendments that are proposed? So I know it takes 34 or more than
38 for
38 for
three-quarters,
ratification,
right.
34 to call, 38 for ratification. Can 36 states do it immediately, and then Nebraska wait 20 years and be like, yeah, we are going to ratify what they did there? And you get with the question.
Yeah, and the answer is, I think we have a great example in the 27th Amendment was ratified 108 years after its proposition. It took that long to get to three-quarters of states. So it sits out there until ratified. And states similarly can withdraw their ratifying vote at any time.
Withdraw the and then the convention, whatever they propose, they could propose 10 different amendments. It doesn't necessarily have to be all wrapped up in one.
That's correct. It goes out as a slate, voted on individually. The original Bill of Rights is a great example. 12 went out, 10 were ultimately ratified, the 11th 108 years later.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Larson. Any additional questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for that
Thank you,
testimony,
Senator.
very informative. Additional proponent testimony to LR 35.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Davis, M-A-R-K, D-A-V-I-S. Thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity to come and speak in front of you. I have that I'd like to submit letters supporting, in support of LR 35 from constituents in every district in Nebraska that we do have copies that we'll distribute to your offices. My family came here in 1852, 2 years before Nebraska became a territory, long before it was a state. We have been a lot like other Nebraskans. We just want to be left alone. You know, we can run our own lives. Sometimes it seems like Nebraska capital can kind of reach out to the countryside. It seems more and more like the federal government is reaching out to the countryside. And that is what these people. That is what I believe as well, and we are really here asking for some relief on that from our representatives. I mean, I would like to welcome Mark Meckler to the Nebraska spring. It was nice 38 degrees out this morning. If we step outside right now, we're going to have several inches of snow, I believe, and several hours to drive. So, I mean, I think we're all sick of winter. We're all looking forward to a spring. We're all looking forward to a lot of different things. But over the past 10 years, I've had the opportunity to travel across this country. We have another winter that we're dealing with, and that's federal government overreach. I've had a lot of complaints, a lot of people saying, what can we do, what can we do, what can we do? There are other places where there are riots, unrest, other things happening. Their answer we come to know as an Arab Spring. That's not the answer that we have here. It's not a solution that we have here. We have what I'm considering to be an American Spring. Right now we have an opportunity to present that as a country and lift the country up and really show a pattern to the world about this is how we bring a federal government into control. I'm not going to keep you all very long. There are some questions that I'm sure you may have. I may be able to answer them. I may not be able to answer them. We're here asking for your help so we can discuss this, both pro and con. Open up the floor and talk about it. That's really what today is all about. Giving us the chance to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions? Senator Groney.
Thank you, Chairman. In your mission, I don't see anything in here where we're going to limit the power of the presidency. Or is that through, because that seems to be a major problem a lot of us are concerned about.
Anything that is brought or proposed as an amendment to the Constitution is going to come from your body.
But we're limited by your description here. Limit the power of the jurisdiction of the federal government. Does that include the presidency?
I believe the president is part of the federal government, yes.
I didn't know what branch you were describing there. You're describing all three.
All three branches.
All right, thank you.
I believe there are abuses being handled in all three of the branches. Once again, the ultimate authority belongs to us. This is a government of the people and for the people. I believe Benjamin Franklin one time said, or was asked, what kind of a government were we given? His answer is, we were given a republic if we can keep it. Are you going to allow us to keep it?
Thank you, Senator Groney. Are there any additional questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you,
Much
Chair.
appreciated. And I'll remind everyone right now that before you begin your testimony to please complete one of these green sheets, and as you begin testifying to please state and spell your name for the record. Can I get a show of hands of how many people intend to testify on this bill today? Got a few more. Okay. To the extent that you can, please try and sit in one of the front two rows. We'd much appreciate it. We have numerous openings in the front couple of rows for those who wish to testify. And welcome to the Government Committee.
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Robert Kirk, R-O-B-E-R-T, K-I-R-K. I'm a citizen of Gearing, Nebraska. I drove 400 miles yesterday afternoon so I could come here and participate in the government process. I really think this is a good government issue. I am heartened by the fact that there is this Article 5 mechanism where we can rein in a federal government that is broken, that's out of control. In my own life, I'm a doctoral level psychologist. Obamacare, the train wreck is happening. I was employed at Regional West Medical Center out in Scottsbluff. The amount of regulations and the amount of jumping around to fulfill every little thing has caused them to be turned upside down. They are hiring people to fill out forms for the federal government and have to let go of providers because they can't reach the overhead. The regulations of the EPA are another example that they want to control every ditch in the country, and they'll send drones and they'll send people with guns to enforce it. The federal government is out of control. We really deserve we need this opportunity as an American people to send our best people to go and hash out what is the best way we can rein in the scope of the federal government, limit the power, and term limits. One term limit I really like is a proposal of the Supreme Court. Why should that be a lifetime appointment? Let's limit it. What, 16 years? I mean, we have some pretty tough, well, we do have a justice, I think it was said before, that really doesn't think the Constitution matters much. And we do have a federal government that thinks laws are okay, except if they don't like them, they won't obey them or they won't enforce them. So isn't it wonderful to know that you are part of a sovereign state? The federal government was created by the states through the people. And now it's totally backwards, where the federal government is trying to, you know, from the light bulbs to the toilets to the cars you can drive to everything. The federal government wants to run our lives. What you can buy in a restaurant or the sodas. And America, if we could just get back to the liberty and allow people to decide and allow each state. I'm much happier to come here to talk to you in Lincoln than if I went to Washington, D.C. and brought up my concerns. How much are they going to be interested in me? I mean, you know they're not going to be interested in all. So I really urge you to get this out to the floor, and Mark Meckler has been great in terms of educating us from a legal perspective of how this can work, and it wouldn't be, the sky wouldn't be falling in. I have to say that when, you know, the chance of something terrible seems so minuscule, but if we don't do anything, where are we headed? We keep going the way we're going now, we all know we're headed for a cliff. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for coming down today. Additional proponent testimony to LR 35. Additional proponents. Welcome to the Government Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Senator Morant. My name is Doug Lever, D-O-U-G. Lever is L-I-E-W-E-R. And I support a convention of states, and I hope that the legislature in the state of Nebraska uses their authority to limit the power of the federal government. And I hope that you would give us a chance to be a voice for the people of the state of Nebraska, and I hope that Senator Larson would be one of the people that could be a delegate, because he is in favor of this. Thank you.
I'm going to have to disagree with that last part of your testimony. Are there any questions for the testifier? Seeing none, thank you very much for coming down today.
Thank you.
Are there additional proponents wishing to speak on LR 35? Welcome back.
Senator Moranti. I'm Kavetta Hansen, K-V-E-T-A, H-A-N-S-O-N, and a lot of things have been covered in my testimony. I'd like to highlight the fact that there are not many who know what to think of the Convention of States that is being voted on in committee today. I have some questions pertaining to this matter, questions for you. Where was the federal government during the first years of the colonial state, colonies in this country? Where was the federal government? Where was the federal government during the colonial war? Where was the federal government before the first convention of states? It just wasn't there. And how did it come to be? Would there be a federal government if there hadn't been a convention of states? They had many before it was all formed. How did the federal government come to be? Was it because the states came together, convened, because their deliberations chose the method to send senators and representatives to work in the federal government? When did it happen that part-time work in the legislature turned into full-time, fully funded, with perks, etc. career. When did it happen that the states weren't in charge of the federal government, and instead the federal government of the United States began running schools, Social Security, setting rules and regulations for everything, etc.? We've already discussed that. That they decide who can work and who can't work, and they're overstepping the Constitution. If you hire help, do the employees follow your directives, or do you follow their orders? How successful are the bosses that let their hired help push them around? Is there something wrong with that picture? Isn't that why we have a runaway federal government now? Let's help the states of the United States take back their authority and, in the checks and balances of this Constitution, maintain their sovereignty while they respect the authority they gave to the federal government in the Constitution. Let's get back to the checks and balances under the authority of God. Let's become the united and sovereign states of America with a federal government of the United States that does the job outlined for it in the Constitution, but not a nanny state government overruling state sovereignty.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for coming down today. Much appreciated. Additional proponent testimony to LR 35.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Government Committee.
My name is Kirk Myers, K-I-R-K, M-Y-E-R-S. Thank you for allowing me to present here today. I think this Article 5 idea here is an awesome time. I think the Founding Fathers wrote that in almost for such a time as we have today. You know, I personally, I believe in the Constitution, what it stands for, what our Founding Fathers founded this country on. I mean, if America loses what was given to it, and we are, where else would we go to live our lives, to raise our families the way our heart dictates? You can look at the federal government, and I mean, we have amnesty with executive order at the stroke of a pen by one man, and it's boom, law of the land. You got the EPA out there. I don't think anybody, I don't know of anyone that's on board with where they're going, especially in Nebraska, where, you know, they're looking at doing hazmat teams. If you have a load of cattle that happen to go to the bathroom on the road, you can't just wash it off the road. They're proposing hazmat teams for that kind of cleanup. Pretty silly in Nebraska, you know. I've seen proposals for milk that in the quantities that's shipped in, that needs to be hazmat. You look at IRS today with the amnesty deal, they're looking at giving refunds to these illegal immigrants. I find that amazing that you're going to take my money and give it to someone that's here illegally. I mean, I don't have any trouble with someone being here legally, but that's the whole point. It needs to, there's a process for that. You can look at our national debt, $18 trillion. Our government is basically stealing from the dead, if you will, those that aren't born yet, our children and our grandchildren that are going to be under such economic bondage just trying to repay what the government's spending today on some very silly programs. The federal government is definitely out of control. The Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, you know, the Civil War, on one hand, the right side won. We got rid of slavery in America. But on the other hand, the real issue was how much power does the federal government have? Is it more than the states? And from that standpoint, the wrong side won, because it did give the federal government more power than the states. Our federal government is is really like a drug addict, addicted to morphine, and I don't believe that they are going to stop voluntarily with controlling themselves. And I think a state Article 5 would be a great way of doing that. We've heard about a runaway convention. You know, if you had an amendment for financially balanced budget, one that said, hey, EPA, you guys have done a great job. You're going in maintenance mode only. Your budget's 50%. Just the air's good right now. The water's good. Just keep it where it's at. Federal education, if you said no more federal education, Common Core is not required. This is a state's issue. It's up to the states to decide how to educate their kids. And all those amendments would all be individual. They'd all be individually voted on. You're going to need to have 3/4 of the states saying, yes, we agree. And to me, that's what America's all about, is all of us as people determining how we're going to be governed and what we're going to allow our government to do to us.
All right, your red light's on, so let's open it up to the committee to see if there are any questions. Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony today.
Thank you.
Are there additional proponents wishing to speak on LR 35? Seeing, oh.
Unfortunately, my husband was here to testify.
Mm-hmm.
He was all prepared. We had car trouble yesterday, and he's gone to the garage.
Okay.
I could read it for him, or I can hand it out.
What we can do is submit it to the page, and we'll have it read into the record.
Okay, that's too bad. It's not very long, and it's pretty good.
All right. Well, we will all read it and take it into account before taking action on the bill. So, seeing no additional proponent testimony, are there any opponents to LR 35? Any opposition testimony to LR 35? How many opponents do we have? Would you? Looks like a couple. One. Yep.
Hello.
And welcome back.
My name is Lana Ferguson. LONAFERGUSON. I'm not good at reading testimony, but I felt that maybe I should do this. So forgive me if I stumble. The Constitution of the United States is the first constitution of its kind and has influenced the constitutions of other nations. Since the Constitution came into the force in 1789, it's been amended 27 times. The Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the United States of America, powers of government. Amendments to the United States Constitution, unlike ones made to many constitutions worldwide, are appended to the end of the document. It has 7 articles and 27 amendments. It is the shortest written constitution in force. All 5 pages of the United States Constitution are written on parchment. If I had 5 pages to show you, and I saw a stack this high, and you probably have stacks this high on your desks, that's what we're talking about, and that's what we're comparing here. I have concerns about the resolution to call a convention of the states. And I've heard it called Constitutional Convention, a con-con, or whatever. But I do know there's only one Article 5 that is going to give prerequisite for whatever you're going to call it to do whatever they want to do. This document was established our republic. And I wish Senator Larson was here because, please note, there is no mention of a democracy in our Constitution, nor the constitutions of the 48 states that were formed afterwards. And It's endured amendments, wars, depressions, and all the good and bad that has happened for over 200 years. We were given a republic if we could keep it. This is not the first time in history that an Article 5 convention has been introduced or called, and thanks to Laura, you know, she has explained that quite well, I believe. We forget that there are other instruments of law that do come into play. It's that balance of powers thing. It's that opportunity for a Supreme Court to stand. And it's that opportunity for a president to do what they do. And it's an opportunity for a senator or a congressman to give statement. I'm always for good government and believe that the people should be the watchdog of those that we elect. However, I have some opinion as some of the following, and fear that we are more vulnerable than ever of a runaway convention that will just amplify the problems that we already have. In listening to debates, and this is the first year that I've ever really attended these things, I've noticed that there's a lot of discussion, a lot of, well, what ifs? How do we do it? You know, that's kind of the focus of our government. Not everybody agrees. We can like each other, but we don't always agree on every issue. So, and we're looking at a federal government, not one that had 13 states. We now have 50. And do they always agree? No. And I would almost reckon to say if any one of you were elected to go there, you might be in the same position of not knowing when to agree or when not to. Quickly, I want to go through these because Arthur Goldberg, I don't really know if he was affiliated with another association. I always wonder, do these people get paid to do what they're doing? But he was an associate justice of the United States Supreme Court, and he said, there is no enforceable mechanism to prevent a convention from reporting wholesale changes to our Constitution and Bill of Rights. Moreover, the absence of any mechanism to ensure representative selection of delegates could put a runaway convention in the hands of a single-issue group whose self-interest may be contrary to our national well-being. I've listed some others, and it would take time to go through them. Christopher Brown, professor of law at the University of Maryland.
Before we get into that, your red light's on. Let's see if there are any questions from the committee. Senator Groening.
Could you tell me what Mr. Brown said?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
And there's one other guy I want to quote, if you'll give me that
I want to know what
privilege.
the other guy said too.
Okay.
Thank you.
In my view, the plurality of amendments opens the door to constitutional change far beyond merely requiring a balanced federal budget. I'll let you read the rest, but there's one I want to go on to. If a general convention were to take place for the avowed and sole purpose of revisiting the Constitution, it would naturally consider itself as having a greater latitude than the Congress appointed to administer and support as well as to amend the system. It would consequently give greater agitation to the public mind. It would probably consist of the most heterogeneous characters, would be the very focus of the flame, which has already too much heated men of all parties, would no doubt contain individuals of insidious views, who under the mask of seeking alterations popular in some parts but inadmissibly in other parts of the Union might have a dangerous opportunity of sapping the very foundations of the fabric. Under all these circumstances, it seems scarcely to be presumable that the deliberations of the body could be conducted in harmony or terminate in the general good. Having witnessed the difficulties and dangers experienced by the first convention, which assembled under every propitious circumstance, I should tremble for the result of a second, meeting in the present tempter of America, and under all disadvantages I have mentioned. The father of the United States Constitution, James Madison, wrote this warning on November 2nd, 1788, at the age of 37, against calling another general constitutional convention. Our Constitution has stood well since that time. Maybe other things need to be looked at. The EPA, that's a department, they make rules. The VA, that's a department, they make rules. Maybe we need to look at the rules in the departments. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there additional questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. Additional opposition testimony to LR 35. If there are additional opponents, we ask that you please come closer to the front, please. We appreciate it. Welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Kathy, K-A-T-H-Y, Wilmot, W-I-L-M-O-T. I appreciate this opportunity. You're kind of like a heart surgeon. You're holding the heart, I think, of this nation in your hand. Please don't drop it on the floor. I began researching this subject in the early 90s when Governor Ben Nelson and Governor Leavitt from Utah were pushing for a constitutional convention and attempting to placate those who say a convention would result in sweeping changes to our Constitution rather than simply submitting amendments. Proponents now call it an Article 5 convention, not a constitutional convention. But despite this attempt to wordsmith, the truth is an Article 5 convention is the only one referred to in Article 5. Who would be in charge of a convention? 2014 Congressional Research Service report states, Congress has traditionally laid claim to broad responsibilities in connection with the convention, including establishing procedures to summon a convention, determining the number and selection process for its delegates, setting internal convention procedures, including formulae for allocation of votes among the states. There is no language in Article 5 that limits a convention to a single topic or amendment. Instead, it refers to amendments in the plural. Warren Burger, former Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, said there's no way, any more than the Continental Congress could control the convention in Philadelphia, to put a muzzle on a constitutional convention. Once it meets, it'll do whatever the majority wants to do. I would not favor it. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia said, I certainly would not want a constitutional convention. Who knows what would come out of it? Proponents argue the first convention was not a runaway, that Congress did not task the convention with only working with the Articles of Confederation, that the convention was acting at the behest of the states and not Congress. Federalist 40 states that in the opinion of Congress, the convention of delegates was to meet at Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they wrote a new constitution and they even changed ratification numbers. Instead, they laid what was actually a runaway convention. Thankfully, the delegates then were true statesmen, men of integrity, ethics, of faith in God. They were not simply representing themselves or special interest groups, but unfortunately many forces today are at work and they lack those qualities. Those forces see our rights as granted by government rather than endowed by a creator. Today, other advocates of an Article 5 convention, and remember it just says convention, are Wolfpack and the Young Turks. Those are liberal media groups funded by Soros, Code Pink, Occupy groups. Could it be that they also see the possibilities of a runaway convention and the chance to actually strip or rewrite our Constitution? Our Constitution's been amended 27 times through a process that does not place our Constitution at risk. No one here, you've heard a lot of, I suppose, hopefully, my interpretation is, but no one can tell you with certainty how much or how such an event would proceed, who would choose delegates, whether the ratification requirement would be changed. Please protect our Constitution, vote no to LR 35, let it die a silent death right here.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you for coming down today. Additional opposition testimony to LR 35. And welcome to the Government Committee.
Thank you for allowing me to be here. My name is Gary Hinsley, H-E-I-N-Z-L-E. I am concerned about LR 35, but I think the people that are trying to do this are has the goodwill of the country at heart. They couldn't be any more conservative than I am. With my age, I'm an original member of the John Birch Society. I'm not nearly as articulate as Kathy Wilmot, but I'm going to cover a few of the same points a little bit. Mark Levine, who is a promoter of this concept, initially was against it because of his concern that I share, that the convention could get out of hand and could be controlled by the wrong people. And this is not a new concept, like Ms. Wilmot said. Governor Ben Nelson was promoting this when he was in office. There are people that are prominent people that you would think knows what they're talking about, are for the Constitution Convention, but on the other side, there's just as prominent people and just as knowledgeable that are against it. I think we have to well, the thing about LR 35 that bothers me is, and it's been alluded to a little bit, is so open-ended. It's not really specific on what it's trying to determine. And the thing that you look at is who's going to initiate the delegates to go to the convention, how many will each state have. There's so many undecided considerations, I think, that really make it questionable how viable the thing's going to be. And I always think that we have reasonably smart people in Nebraska that are politically savvy, but we wouldn't stand a chance to those devious folks in Washington, D.C. So I strongly encourage this committee to vote against LR 35. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for coming down today. Continuing on with opposition testimony to LR 35. And welcome to the Government Committee.
Thank you. My name is Linus Miller, Linus Miller. I'm not a very learned person. I don't have a wall full of degrees. I have a few, but the concern I have is this convention has no bounds. Once they start, they can do pretty much whatever they want, and you have no recourse on that. We can't even run a government that has specified procedures to do things, and we can't follow them. So how are you going to rein in or control something like this constitutional convention? I mean, we have elections. Well, are they legitimate elections? No, they're not. Our election process has been tainted. We have a census every 10 years to equalize representation. Well, under our current regime, we're going to include all the illegals in this country in the census. That's tainting. Who are you representing? Are you representing the legitimate citizens of the United States, or are you representing the illegals? That, since our president has decided that we are going to include the illegals, the census is not valid because we don't have a valid count. Also, you talk about legal elections, and the Secretary of State is supposed to justify and control the ballot. Well, as far as people running for office? Does the Secretary of State ensure that they're eligible? No. I've written the Secretary of State, and he's written back to me. They do this by whoever, wherever, but he gets a sheet saying who the different delegates are going to be, and that's who he puts on the ballot. There's no justification that that man is legal, that he is eligible to serve. And so if we don't have eligible people running, how can we say it's a legitimate election? And if we can't run an election and we can't run anything else, then how are we going to change it, the process? Because even if we change the process, they aren't going to approve it, or they aren't going to abide by it. And that's where our problem is today. We are not abiding by the rules that are written. I guess I got a red light. So
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any questions for the testifier? Seeing none, thank you very much for coming down today. Much appreciated. Additional opposition testimony to LR 35. Are there any additional opponents? Is there any neutral testimony on LR 35? Seeing none, Senator Epke, you are recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the committee, for listening to this conversation we're having today. I just want to make two quick points, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to talk to you yet today or any other time. First of all, let's remember that this is not a constitutional convention. It's the convention of the states. It is a legitimate way of proposing amendments to the Constitution. And if I thought, those who know me know that I am, I define myself as a constitutionalist oftentimes, and if I were of any mind that this could turn into a runaway convention, I would run away from it as fast as I could. I just don't believe that it's a reasonable fear at this point. The second thing I would say is I have a friend who works out in Washington, D.C., works for a conservative organization out there, does a lot of training, and I respect his views on this sort of stuff a lot. And I asked him, I said, what do you think of the whole idea of a convention of the states? And he said, Laura, a year ago I would have thought it was a terrible idea, but I've grown to believe that we don't have any other choice. He said, that if we do nothing, we will never get hold of what's going on in our federal government. So I would leave you with that. I thank you for your attention today, and if you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Senator Epke. Are there any final questions for the Senator? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I know we had some letters on this one. Thank you, Charles. And before we close the hearing on LR 35, I have two letters of opposition. One from Ed Reeker from North Platte, representing himself, and the other from Sherry Miller of the League of Women Voters of Nebraska. And with that, we close the hearing on LR 35, and that ends our hearings for the day. Thank you very much for coming down. Much appreciated.